Hello and welcome to Alive in Composing, the wonderful world of innova with today's guest, Patrick Castillo. Would you please state your name for the record?
My name is Patrick Castillo. I'm a composer and thrilled to be here in the wonderful world of innova.
And guilty as charged.
Yes.
Now, we're doing a longitudinal, very, very scientific study about composers, performers, and their pets. Do you have any household pets? And if so, what would they be called?
I do. I have two cats. I have a brown tiger-striped short hair named Puzzle and a Siamese named Wembley.
Okay, I'm now going to ask about those names, Puzzle and Wembley. Does that show some hidden side to your creativity?
I'm afraid not. Puzzle just seemed right, so I guess so. Yeah, we can say that. You remember Fraggle Rock?
Kind of.
Wembley is one of the Fraggles, and my Wembley is a handful.
So it's nothing to do with the stadium in London?
No, hardly. Queen has not played in my Siamese cat.
Oh, well, yeah, it's too late for that. And when you're not hard at work at the manuscript paper, the keyboard, the baton, the laptop, or anything else that we're going to get to in a moment, how do you spoil yourself? How do you reward yourself?
How do I reward myself? I have a very nerdy answer, I'm afraid.
Go for it.
I sit and I listen to music.
That's surprising.
This is what I do. I at the end of a long day, I like nothing better than a glass of scotch or wine, and I'll put something on. The latest innova release, usually.
Okay, so you like the crunchy form of relaxation, not the kind of bliss out.
Yeah. No, I mean, that has its place too. Sometimes it'll be, Billie Holiday or something to sort of soothe the nerves. But no, I like to keep stimulated. As a musician also, as a composer who's working with pencil and paper all day, I'm not actually listening to music in a physical sense, and so that is a kind of release for me to actually sit and just absorb physical sound waves.
You mentioned pencil and paper. What are they?
Yeah, I still work. I'm a Luddite. I still work with pencil and paper. It's unless I'm doing electronic music. Electronics, just as a matter of course, the pencil and paper is digital. I'm working with software or whatever, but when I'm conceptualizing and when I'm just writing acoustic music, I still work with pencil and paper. I prefer the tactile quality of it, and also just in terms of conceptualizing and organizing ideas, it works for me.
Do you do visual arts? Do you other forms of creative expression too?
Not really. I write a little bit. I wouldn't say that I write at an exceptionally high level, but when I'm composing, actually, part of the pencil and paper is that I can draw shapes, and I can write little verses to myself to capture ideas before they're fully formed as sonic ideas. Before that, they're very abstract conceptual ideas, and they'll take whatever shape they take before they get translated into notes on the staff.
So this is one of the purposes of my interrogation here, is to really find out how you are like your music. And it seems there's a kind of physical, tactile connection between what you're imagining, what you're doing, and what you're scribing in your gestural language. Can you see any similar qualities between you and your music?
Yeah, I think that's fair, because for me the practice of composing is, it's not just philosophy. It's experiential, and I try to make my music that way as well. It's not just eye candy on the score, but I try to make something that one does have a kind of, I'll use the same word, tactile. I hope it has that kind of that kind of crunchiness to it that you feel like you can get your hands around the music. And I think that my music sonically aspires to textural manifestation primarily, more than melodic, harmonic. Of course, all of that stuff is of a piece, but I do think in terms of shapes and textures, and so my music, it'll have a softness to it, or it'll surround the listener, I hope, or sometimes maybe a punch in the face is the appropriate gesture. But that is how I think about sound.
Cast your mind back not too long ago to your very first sound memory. Can you think what that was?
My very first sound memory. Well, I remember the sound of my earliest memory, if that
counts.
essentially answers the question. It's a perverse memory. I was 3 or 4 years old, and I was banging my head repeatedly against a screen door in my family's house. We were living in the Philippines at the time, and in a sort of strange, I had a kind of childhood epiphany where I was saying repeatedly as a mantra to myself, today is the day it is now, tomorrow is the day after today, and yesterday is the day before today. Like I had just discovered this. And while I was doing this, I was banging my head against the wall, and so my again, going to what we were saying about, you know, my music and how I compose, my earliest sonic memory is also my earliest experiential memory. I remember the sound of my voice and my head banging repeatedly against the door.
Just like John Cage told Schoenberg about understanding harmony,
that's right,
like banging his head against the wall.
Eventually the door did break, and here we are today.
Now, what have you learned from your teachers and mentors? You've had a couple that are particularly interesting, Lois Virk, Anea Lockwood. Some of those seem to be kind of in your general realm of environmentally, kind of globally listening too, right?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the most valuable lesson that I learned from all of my teachers, and Richard Wilson was a major one that deserves mention alongside Lois and Anea. They taught me how to listen, and they taught me how to listen with great breadth and curiosity. My very first assignment from Lois Virk actually was to listen to Edgar Varèse's ionizations, which she introduced me to. I'd never heard this before, and my analysis assignment was to draw the piece, and so that obviously has set me on a certain course as well to think about music in terms of contours and shapes and textures. Anea, similarly, you know, my introduction to Anea's music was beginning to study with her, and so I went to the music library at Vassar College where I studied with her, and they had her complete catalog, and I dug into it, and I'd never heard music made the way that she makes music, you know, pieces of glass being shoved along a tabletop and dropped on the floor and things like that, and the way that sounds that are not conventionally musical sounds, the way that we think about music, could be sculpted into a structure, into a form that was not only orally satisfying but could have meaning, could have emotive import. That to me, that set my world on fire, discovering the music of those two. And then with Richard Wilson, I mean, his music is much more academically focused, and so I sort of honed my craft under his tutelage as well. You know, doubling the flute and the vibraphone in this register won't work, do it that way. And so
you're also a performer, right?
Somewhat, yeah, as necessary.
Because your music strikes me as one that is very friendly to the performers, that ask them to do understandable things in creative ways. Yeah,
I mean, I don't ask them to do too many very outre things. You know, they're not biting the reed very often and things like that. Yeah, you know, I as a performer, and I use performer very loosely because it's almost offensive to the performers that I work with to classify myself in their league, but you know, we'll encounter a lot of scores where as a composer I can see what the composer had in mind, because I've had such things in mind, but they're utterly impractical on paper sometimes. You know, like a very strange time signature change, and then a rest divided in a very difficult way, but then there's a fermata over it, and you know, there's no reason for that. But I can sympathize because I know what it feels like to write a phrase and come to that point and feel like, well, no, it is a 3/16, but it has to be suspended indefinitely, but it feels that way. And I feel like my job as a composer is to not only manifest the ideas, but you know, when we talk about composition as opposed to, I don't know, songwriting or improvisation, I mean, ultimately these are all of the same cloth, but composed music is about codifying the idea in a certain linguistic way that can be, that can be shared without too much difficulty. So that's a core value of mine for certain.
Am I right in thinking you're also a sociology major in addition to music?
Yeah.
Now, how does your music make a difference in the world?
I feel like that should be obvious, Philip. How does my music make a difference in the world? As a sociologist, I don't have a satisfactory answer for that. But as an artist, I hope that, just there's virtue in making art, and I wouldn't want to live in a world where people weren't expressing themselves in these ways.
Well, you're also like the Carl Sagan of program notes. I mean, you somehow convey not only through your own composition and your performances, but also interpreting, and you work on behalf of other organizations.
I do.
Eloquently. How does that all tie into this?
Well, that's probably, to provide a more serious answer to your previous question, I mean, that's probably more rooted in my training in sociology, which is basically worthless at this point, except for the fact that I learned to write in a certain way. And so I also, I didn't go to conservatory. I went to a liberal arts college. I haven't been surrounded by such an intensely concentrated coterie of musicians the way that most of my present day coterie of musicians were brought up. And so I've had to spend a lot of my life and career explaining music to non-musicians, whether it was my own or that of composers long dead or composers still with us. And so it's just, that's not something that you can really train for, I think. Maybe you can train for. I just haven't been properly trained. But it's, I think it's an important part of what we do.
So what is the quality of mercy?
The quality of mercy is a few things. It's the name of my recent Innova record. It's also the title of one of the major multi-movement works on the record. The title comes from The Merchant of Venice. It's a great soliloquy from Portia in The Merchant of Venice. The quality of mercy is not strained, etc., etc. To me, that idea, it has such tremendous poetical appeal to attempt to define the tangible quality of something abstract and intangible. And so in my piece, The Quality of Mercy, I took a lot of cues in terms of character from Shakespeare, but also from other things, from other conflicts, and I don't mean conflicts in a necessarily aggressive way, but just dissonances, and how do disparate elements coexist. And so the piece is very much about that in some places in a very academic way. Something as prosaic as here's an acoustic instrument and here's an electronic patch, and how are these two going to interact? How do we reconcile these two elements? But then in other ways, the piece works on a much more personal level. There are some pieces, there are some movements in the piece that use essentially discarded crap music of mine that I've tried to rework in a way that I would continue to be happy with. And so in a way, this seems very emo or whatever to say, but it represents the act of self-forgiveness, which I think, not to be too solipsistic about it, but I think that for an artist, that's an important cathartic skill to have as well, to forgive oneself the places where we stumble, because I have days where I'll compose for several hours, and then at the end of the day, my wife, who's a fabulous violinist and also so great artist and understands what it is that I do, and she'll ask me if she'll say, did you get some good composing done? And at the end of a day where I feel like I didn't really produce anything of value, I still feel like I got some good composing done, because I feel like you have to get through that exercise of producing work that is not satisfactory in order to find your music, and I think that requires a certain degree of forgiveness of oneself.
Can you tell on short notice what is good and what's bad with your days composing, or does it take a certain distance of time?
It takes some distance. I mean, sometimes I know, sometimes it takes some distance. Sometimes I find that I'm wrong in one direction or another, much later on. And actually that piece is a case in point. There were ideas that I had discarded in other pieces that I just felt like I'll never come back to that again. And then I revisited old sketches and found, well, that cello solo that I felt like really didn't work, if I just do this to it, I can build something around it and be quite happy with it.
What else is on the album?
The album also has a multi-movement cantata. This is the Hour of Lead for mezzo-soprano and flute, string quartet, piano and percussion. That's a piece that actually in its original incarnation was for a great singer and a great friend of mine, Philip Chia, who is a baritone and countertenor. So he's got this remarkable range. You mentioned Frank Oteri, he worked a lot with Frank. And Philip asked for this piece to commemorate the anniversary of a death in his family. And so we worked together on selecting the texts, and then got together on what he wanted to do vocally in the piece. And so the piece still exists in that form, but it doesn't travel well in that form. And so I revised it. I prepared a version for mezzo-soprano, which also suggested various revisions in the orchestration, and in some passages I retouched as well. So that cycle sets texts by Dickinson and Yeats. The first movement is Dickinson, the last movement is Yeats. The central movement is a wordless vocalise, and there are 2 instrumental interludes in between the vocal movements. And then aside from that, in the middle of the record is Cirque, which is a short, very short piece, very pithy piece for solo violin.
Would you ever consider setting your own text?
Yeah, I've thought about it. In fact, I can reveal now that the text that is not credited in The Quality of Mercy on the record is my own. I typically don't sign my name to it because, again, I can't pretend to be a poet or anything like that. Those were just lines that I jotted in a notebook after reading Pale Fire by Nabokov, and I don't know, just it resonated somehow, and I put it in the piece. So yeah, I've thought about it. I wrote a piece for the violinist Kristen Lee last year for violin, electronics, and spoken word, and the text there was largely pastiche, but it was my work.
And when you work with electronics in combination with acoustic instruments, how do you consider that connection?
I try to make it very organic, so it's primarily live audio processing. Occasionally there will be pre-recorded material, but I find it much more satisfying to set up a system and not predetermine the sounds, but set up a system where the musicians will be mic'd, not for amplification, but for signal processing, and then I'll set something up that will, take some spectral analysis of the cello line, and then do something ethereal with it, or whatever. We don't have to nerd out too much on max patches and such, but that's, I try to make it conversational in that way.
Well, I think we've nerded out exactly enough, and thank you for telling us about your life and work.
Thank you, Philip, for the opportunity.